Phyllis, we cannot hear you.
Okay, let's start all over again.
Yes.
The computer is, the iPad is working. I hope. Good afternoon, friends and newcomers, to our Friday special conversations with special people. Today we have a very special guest, Annette Feltz. She's an international relocation consultant. And Annette first spoke here on January 7th, 2016 on the topic cultural differences. And then on February 1st, 2018 on the topic the Netherlands. Today's topic is working on international teams, something quite timely, I think. How I found Annette, she came into our library one day to take out books, and before she knew it, I said, you have so much to offer us. And she will tell you a little bit about her own life and where she was born and everything. So I'm not going to take that away from her because she has been able to share her knowledge about being a part of our understanding of the world beyond the United States. And I've learned a lot from her, and I appreciate, Annette, that you are busy with your family and your work, and you still are doing this for us. So please let me tell you how much I appreciate it, and it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our very special guest and friend, Annette Feltz.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I still cannot get my video to work. Phyllis, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see me and hear me?
No, I could hear you, but I can't see you.
Okay, and there I am. Okay, thank you, Michael. All right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'd like to thank Phyllis and Michael for giving me this opportunity. It's always fun to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart and to share it with everybody around me. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and I'd also like you to know that my parents are on the video as well from the Netherlands. Mom, Dad, if you can wave. There you go. If you have your video on, those are my parents. Right. So working in global teams, something that's near and dear to my heart. And now my slides are not working. There we go. So as Phyllis mentioned, my name is Annette Feltz, and my company is Expatriate Assistance. And what I do is I make the foreign familiar. I work with expatriates, that's people who move from one country to another country. I work with them and I help them settle in. So I help them with the basics of getting a driver's license, setting up a bank account, getting a social security number. But I also work with intercultural communication. And intercultural communication is understanding your way of communicating, your way of how you see the world, and learning how your new host country sees the world and how they communicate and build a bridge between the two. And finally, I coach expatriates and their families on settling in and making the US their new home country. So you can imagine I work a lot with people from different countries, and I work a lot with people who move from one country to another country, and back home they were successful, and then when they come to this new country, the US, suddenly they're not as successful. And that's where I come in and help them understand what's going on and how to work in global teams. Now, why global teams? Global teams has become so much more popular. It's so many more companies have decided to work in teams, and especially in global teams. And why has that suddenly the trend? Well, one of the reasons is, of course, because the world is getting smaller now with internet. The world is getting a lot smaller. Companies that used to only have an office in one or maybe two countries now have offices in many countries. And I'm sorry, the leaf blowers are outside of my window, so I'm just trying to block out the background noise. But anyway, it used to be that companies only had an office maybe in the US and maybe one in New York, but now companies have offices in every country where they do business, and they do business in a lot more countries. So it's very important to involve your staff when you make decisions, but it's also very important to focus on where your customers are. The other reason it's very important to start working in global teams is because the management style is changing. Millennials, who make up more than 50% of the workforce these days, they demand a different management style. They grew up differently from previous generations. They're used to working in teams. They're used to being able to say what they think. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, companies used to have a strong leader. Think of Steve Jobs, think of Jack Welch from GE. Strong leaders who told everybody in the company what the company was going to do and how everybody was going to do it. And that worked really well until the millennials came with their own style and they demanded to have a say. And so management style has shifted to a style where teams make decisions and teams tell management what should be done. The knowledge is now more in the lower levels. It's not necessarily in the C-suite. The C-suite is the executive suite. The executive suite has taken on a function from the sole decision maker to facilitator. And finally, another reason, and this is the most important reason, or for my line of work, the most important reason, is that diversity. People are moving around. It's no longer special or abnormal to move to another country, to pack up and start a new life in a different country. So people from different ethnic backgrounds are now working with in diverse teams. And McKinsey did a study 5 years ago showing that teams that are ethnically and racially diverse are 35% more successful than teams that consist of the same ethnic and racial backgrounds. So what makes a successful team? I've been talking about teams, but what makes a successful team? Well, of course, the team structure. You have to have the right people, the team has to have a purpose, the team has to have a role in the company mission, they have to have a mandate, people within the team have to have different roles. Dr. Ruth Wagman from Harvard has done a lot of research on that. And while I'd love to talk about that, we only have an hour, so I'm going to dive into something else that makes a team successful. And that is Google's Project Aristotle. They researched successful teams and they found that once you have the team structure in place, you have the right people, they all have a purpose, they have a mandate, there's still a huge difference between the teams. So Google went and researched, well, what makes these teams that structure-wise are the same, what makes them so successful? And one thing that made them successful, or the thing that made them successful is the teams with high psychological safety were most successful. So what is this psychological safety that Google found? Well, it's basically that all the team members believe that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. There's interpersonal trust and mutual respect, and everybody is comfortable being themselves. So nobody is afraid to ask questions, even though they might think it's a stupid question or an embarrassing question. It's a safe space where people can ask questions and come up with ideas without these ideas being shot down. Everybody listens to each other and everybody respects each other. So it's really the team connections, how the various team members work together. And that's the focus of my talk today. It's team connections between team members from different countries. Now, normally I do a poll here, but there's not enough time. But if you were to ask people all over the world the following question, you would get varied answers. And the question is, most organizations would be better off if conflict could be eliminated forever. So basically, do you think conflict in an organization is good or bad? And the results might surprise you. Here are the number of people who agree that conflict should be eliminated. Now, this was a study done by Mr. Joint and Mr. Warner, and they only interviewed Western countries. They didn't interview any Asian countries. Now, this study has been repeated over and over, but not in as much of a formal sense as the original authors of the study. But what you can see here is that Western countries, the US, my home country of the Netherlands, conflict is good. They do not agree that it should be eliminated. If you go to Asian countries, and I put this in parentheses because, first of all, Asia is very big. It's not just one country, it's many countries. But the general trend in Asia is that conflict is bad. They don't like conflict. And again, Asia was not part of the study, but if you take variations of these studies, you will find a general trend towards Asians saying that conflict should be eliminated. So going back to these team connections, imagine being on a team with Americans and Asians, let's just say Japanese. The Americans, they think conflict is fine. Conflict is healthy. Conflict brings creativity. The Asians think the exact opposite. Now imagine being on a team and having to work towards a shared objective together. And you look at this one thing of what role does conflict play in our team? Completely different. You can imagine that team is probably not very successful. Now, I'm mentioning countries here. I'm talking about Asians, I'm talking about Japanese, I'm talking about Americans. I just want to say that this information is not meant to stereotype cultures. It's just a way to stimulate the discussion about cultural systems in general. So when I say Americans are like this, Asians or Japanese, Chinese, Indians, Dutch are like that, doesn't mean that every American is like this. And of course, I'm sure you know that by just looking at your friends or your family. But this is just a very broad generalization in order to start a discussion. This is not meant to stereotype. So going back to all these cultural differences, there is a whole field of study called intercultural communication. And the founder of this field is a Dutch guy named Geert Hofstede, or Americans would pronounce him Hofstede. And his definition is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes members of one group or category from another group. That's kind of outdated. As intercultural communication became more and more mainstream, another Dutch guy showed up. His name is von Strompenaars. And he defined it as intercultural communication allows you to step outside of your own biases and stereotypes. And in order to do so, or in doing so, you can see how another culture might approach a problem differently. So basically, quoting James Bradley, culture is acquired knowledge people use to interpret experiences and generate behavior. So it's very important to understand how one culture looks at the exact same problem as another culture and how they might interpret this problem differently. Which is, of course, very important if you're going to be working together in a team with different national cultures. So culture, what is it? Well, we discussed what it is, but where does it come from? It comes from the history and the geography and the climate, just to name a few. And the American culture is a great example. America is a brand new country. People came here with nothing and they had to build their own country. So they had to take risks. So if you look at how risk taking is viewed across different cultures, for Americans, risk taking is part of life. It's what they've always done ever since this country was founded. But if you take countries that have been around for a long, long time, they had to take less risk. For example, my native country of the Netherlands, risk is not always seen as a good thing because it wasn't necessary. In my country, cooperation is a much greater value. Geography also influences a country's culture. Think of Greece, where Confucius or Aristotle came from. Greece has a lot of islands, and it's located very strategically in the Mediterranean Sea. It was a stop for all the trades. Everybody who had any kind of trade in the Mediterranean area would always stop in Greece. So Greece had a lot of influence from a lot of different countries, and that really had a big impact on their culture. Climate also determines a country's culture. You can imagine if it's really hot, it's very difficult to work around the hottest time of the day. So that's why, for example, in Spain, they have their long siestas. And that creates a culture of taking a rest in the middle of the day, taking it easy. While here in the US, we like to work hard. All of these things determine a country's culture. And of course, this is very broad thinking. I mean, just think of the US. The North, the climate is very different than the South, or the geography is very different. So again, I'm just painting in very broad strokes to give you an idea. Another thing that had a big influence on a country's culture are two philosophers. We had Confucius, um, who was big in the Eastern Hemisphere, and Aristotle, who was big in the Western Hemisphere. And Confucius focused on relationships and harmony. So the Eastern cultures are very big on relationships and harmony, and we'll get into that. Aristotle was very big on individual. Everything is its own individual, and on logic. And we'll get back to this as we dive into different cultures and cultural dimensions. So going back to working in global teams and what is so important about working in global teams. Well, as Google came up with, psychological safety is the #1 determinant of whether a team will be successful. Psychological safety, it means that everybody feels right at home in the team, everybody feels respected and feels comfortable to say and what they mean and share their ideas. So what is this psychological safety? Well, as you can imagine, it's based on trust. How do people define trust? How do you get trust? It's determined by how we communicate, and it's determined by how we make decisions, hierarchies. So let's dive into that. Um, as I mentioned, Geert Hofstede was the founding father of intercultural communication. These days, there is an American woman who lives in Paris, and her name is Erin Meyer, and she's done her own research, and she came up with the culture map. She came up with different dimensions of culture against which to map countries. So I have mapped the US, the Netherlands, India, and China. And I picked these countries because, well, we're in the US. I added the Netherlands because that is my home country, and that's always fun to compare. I also selected India and China because they are two very big, probably the two biggest important export partners. So we'll be comparing these 4 countries. And as I mentioned, psychological safety depends on understanding how other cultures communicate, how they make decisions, and what they base their trust on. And as you can tell, there's a wide variety here. I hope you can see my mouse. And we'll be going deeper into this, but as you can tell, the US and the Netherlands have a very different way of communicating than India and China. And India is this red, China is the yellow, the Netherlands is the blue, and the US is the orange. So let's start with trust. And with trust, why do you trust somebody? What is that trust based on? So here in the United States, trust is based on something very rational, a task. If you're going to hire somebody, you look at their resume. You look at what they've done. You look at what they've accomplished. You look at where they went to school. All very logical indicators of who this person is and why or why not you should hire this person. If you go to countries that base trust on relationships, they work more with their heart. They, of course, they look a little bit at what you've done in your resume, but they look more at your relationship. They will hire people based on the fact that they have a good relationship with you. So if you were to take your American resume and go to China, and maybe you've gone to Harvard and you have accomplished so much, you might have difficulties finding a job because people will hire somebody based on the relationship that they have. So for companies, it's very important when a Western company does business in the East, it's very important to invest a lot of time, and I mean a lot of time, on building a relationship. And if you talk to anybody who's done business in relationship-based countries, you'll see that they've traveled there many times and have gone to many dinners and many events and drinks and festivities without ever talking business. It's very frustrating. If you don't understand how it works, it's very frustrating because we Westerners, we expect to go somewhere, come with our credentials, share our ideas, share the financials, and then get a yes or no. Boom, one or two business, and you have a decision. For countries, and this is India and this is China, they are much more heart relationship based. So it's very important to plan on spending a lot of time building a relationship. And by building that relationship, you win their trust. And that's the way to do business. Another big difference between these four countries is how these countries communicate. So the US is very much a low context country. The Netherlands is also a low context country. China and India, very high context countries. Now, what does this mean, low context versus high context? Low context means mean what you say what you mean. Be very clear, spell out exactly what you want done. So if I ask somebody, can you have this ready tomorrow? And this person tells me, yes, I can, or no, I cannot, then I know that if they say yes, it will be ready tomorrow. It's very important to communicate and say exactly what you mean. So also another thing here in the US, and again in the Netherlands, you say what you want. I would like you, in business, you would say, I would like you to do this, and this is how I suggest you do it. First do this, then do that, and then do that. Very clear. The reason that communication is so clear and so concise in a low context country is because, especially in the United States, there are people from many different cultures. So you have to be clear on what you mean. If you're not clear, somebody from one culture might interpret your instructions one way, and somebody from another culture might interpret it another way. In high context countries, those are countries that are very homogeneous. People all, there's very little immigration. Everybody knows that when you say something, they know exactly what you mean. There's a lot, the focus is very much on harmony, on saving face, not so much on the words that are being said, but on how it is being said, body language. So for example, one business case I recently worked with was an American who went to, I think it was China, and he asked somebody, can you come in and work on Saturday? And now the American was the boss and the Chinese was one of his employees. And so the employee said, yes. And then the person went on to say, it's my daughter's birthday. We're going to have a big party. Now, of course, the American was like, well, that's great. Have fun at your party, but I'm so glad you're able to make a few hours to come in and work. And guess what? Did the person show up the next day? No, the person did not show up. Because when we in the West hear, yes, I will be there, we think it means, yes, I will be there. But somebody in the East is much more focused on maintaining harmony and saving face. So just saying no disrupts the harmony. And you basically cannot say no. It's very difficult to say no to your manager. So instead of saying an outright no, it's much easier to say yes, but in fact mean no by your body language, by the clues you're giving. The clue of, it's my daughter's birthday. I've got family coming in. Somebody from that local culture would have understood that when this person says yes, that really they meant, no, I'm not coming, because they went on to talk about this big birthday party. So you can imagine if you're working in a global team and somebody says yes, and you're used to yes being yes and no being no, but the other person is used to yes being maybe yes, maybe no, and definitely not saying the word no. You can imagine how, if you have to work together with somebody, it gets kind of messy. So it's very important to understand how these other cultures work and what their communication really means. So going back to psychological safety, we talked about communication, we talked about trust, but also the way that decisions are made. The Netherlands is one of the most egalitarian societies, together with Sweden. The US is quite egalitarian. Asian countries are much more hierarchical. And when I say egalitarian, I mean that everybody is involved in making a decision. If there is an issue, people discuss, everybody gets a say, everybody is listened to. It's very important that everybody gets a say and everybody's input is taken into account. In hierarchical societies, the boss says something and everybody who works for the boss does it. There's no discussion about what's going on. Is this really the right thing? Whatever the boss says, you do. So now imagine working in a team and nobody talks about how we're going to make decision. The Dutch is going to expect everybody to communicate. Yet somebody from India is going to expect to sit there and have them be told what to do. So you can imagine how messy it can get if this is not discussed beforehand. So those are the most important parts of working in international team. Understanding how people gain trust, how they communicate, and how they make decisions. So what does this mean for the individuals on the team? Well, first of all, check your assumptions. Again, going back to the example of yes is yes, or other cultures saying yes is maybe no. Check your assumption. If somebody tells you something and it just doesn't make sense, check your assumptions. Check, okay, I would have interpreted this way, but maybe this person means something else. And always assume positive intent. If something goes wrong, don't assume that this person hates you or that they're trying to make your life difficult. No, it's just that they look at the world differently. And just assume positive intent. They look at the world differently. Maybe they meant something differently. And be very aware of what you are projecting, and not only in words, but also in body language. Crossing your arms, and I'm not sure if everybody can see me, but crossing your arms in our Western culture means that you're very skeptical. In other cultures, it might mean something completely different. For example, in Western cultures, this means come here, and this means go away. But when I was in Greece a few summers ago, it turned out that this means come here, which of course, when somebody went like this, I walked away thinking they want me to go. I didn't understand why they wanted me to go. And afterwards I understood, oh, they wanted me to come. It just means something different. Another thing when you work with different cultures is to be aware of using I and you statements. Whenever there is a miscommunication, and again, there will be miscommunications, don't blame the other person. Don't say, you said you would be there tomorrow and you weren't there. It's not that person's fault. It's a miscommunication. So whenever you're discussing issues, look at how you viewed the issue. I thought that because you said yes, I thought you were going to show up tomorrow. That's my point of view, and give the other person an explanation or time to explain how they thought. And finally, create common ground. Get to know the person, get to know their interests, become friends. Once you have more of a personal relationship, it's a lot easier to discuss all these differences and to discuss a way forward and discuss how you work and how the other person works and find common ground. Also, learn to value and accept differences. It is a lot easier to work with people who are just like you. Everybody knows what everybody says, what they mean, and what they're supposed to do. It's easy, but it's no fun. You don't learn anything new. It's a lot more fun and a lot more productive to surround yourself with people who are not like you. You'll be learning new things. You'll learn different perspectives. You probably looked at something one way, and then suddenly you'll meet somebody who looks at the exact same thing in a different way. It's a lot of fun to surround yourself with people of different cultures. You get to taste new foods. You get to learn about new celebrations. It makes life a lot more interesting. And it gives value to working in a global team. As I mentioned in the beginning, 5 years ago, McKinsey figured out that 25 to 35% more productivity if you have a global team, because people will look at a problem and come up with completely new solutions that a national team may not have thought of. And of course, taking a cross-cultural training. What you've just witnessed was a very, very brief overview of a cross-cultural training. Learning more about different cultures and communicating about different cultures can really enrich your life and make companies so much more productive. So this is what you can do from a personal level. Now, what can a business do? What can a company do to work across borders? Well, of course, cross-cultural training, taking a training like this and learning more about different cultures and how to make use of these cultures and learning about how I look at things and how that influences how I behave. But we talked about communication. It's also very important to establish different channels of communication. Going back to the hierarchical culture where the boss tells the employees to do something. And maybe there's an employee who thinks, well, this isn't very smart. Oh, this is going to go wrong. That employee will not feel comfortable going back to the boss and saying, maybe there's another way of doing this. So there have to be different ways to communicate, especially in these teams. So your team member from a hierarchical culture will not feel comfortable in a brainstorm session. They're not used to coming up with ideas. So doing a brainstorm session in your international team is great for people in a Western culture, but in Eastern cultures, that will not work. So perhaps if you want to have a brainstorm session, make it anonymous. Instead of speaking your ideas, writing them down anonymous, and then having somebody read all the different ideas. This way, the person who is not used to expressing their ideas is able to express their ideas anonymously. So make sure there are different ways for feedback, communication, um, different ways that will make all people comfortable. So find out how people like to communicate and then adjust your meeting structure and your communication structure to that. Also establish very clear norms and rules. Everybody comes in with different norms. Everybody is going to have to get used to deviating from their own norms. So establish these norms. Is it acceptable to discuss ideas? Is it acceptable to tell somebody that you agree or you do not agree? For some people it may be, for some people it may be not. But by talking about it and as a group deciding what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, you can pull in the people who aren't used to, for example, giving feedback. They're not used to it, but you decide that in this team, we give each other feedback within reason. Then this person may actually learn to give feedback and feel comfortable to do that within the team. Another very important uh, thing to establish is to divide the project into very small commitments. Remember, we all communicate differently and we all see timelines differently. We all see time differently. In the US, if you say this is ready on Monday at 9 a.m., it will be ready at Monday 9 a.m. Other cultures, Monday 9 a.m. means, yeah, we'll aim for Monday 9 a.m. But you know what? If something different comes up, we'll just have to wait until Tuesday. So you can imagine that if your timeline, if your next check-in is 3 weeks from now, and people have different views on when something should be ready and different views on time, you can imagine that discovering this after 3 weeks is going to delay a project. But if you have regular check-ins, is this ready? Are we on time? Why are we not on time? You can make adjustments. Another very important thing when working in international teams is having a cultural collaborator. And a cultural collaborator is a person who is very experienced in working in international environments, who understands all these cultural differences. And if something comes up, they can actually clarify it. I visited a friend in Norway, a friend who had lived with me in New Jersey, and she had moved to Norway, and we were in a group of in Norway, and we met a group of people, and they asked, "Where are you from?" And my friend said, "We're from Jersey," because if somebody from California would have asked us where you're from, you would have said, "We're from Jersey," and everybody knows that Jersey really is New Jersey, and everybody knows where New Jersey is and what it means. But if you go to another country and you say, "I'm from Jersey," they probably have no idea where Jersey is. They might know where New Jersey is, but nobody knows where, or very few people outside of the US know where Jersey is, and that Jersey is really New Jersey. So it's very important for me to jump in and say, "Oh yeah, we're from New Jersey, one of the 50 states in the US. We're from just outside of New York." And then people were like, "Oh, you're from New York. Oh, that's wonderful. I've been there. Oh, what a great city." Everything. So it's very important to have somebody who understands that people communicate differently, and when that person sees that there's a misunderstanding, that they can jump in and right the wrongs. And finally, it's very important to make sure that the team members have a responsibility that match their culture. So if there is a team member who is from a culture which is very hierarchical and they're not allowed to make decisions, then in this global team, don't give them something where they have to go back to their culture and they have to make decisions. So make sure that team members' responsibility matches their culture. And a very Western response would be, well, that wouldn't be fair. Then, some people are going to have much more responsibility than other people. Yeah, and you know what? That's probably fine, because some people are very comfortable with responsibility, and some people from other cultures are not very comfortable with high levels of responsibility. So I hope that after all of this, and it's a lot of talking, that's the problem with Zoom, there's very little interaction, but after all of this, I hope you have 3 takeaways. And first of all, when you're working in a global team, make sure you create this psychological safety, establish trust, and understand and value the differences. Make use of the differences in communication and decision making. Second of all, check your assumptions and value all these differences. And finally, on an organizational level, you have to create a structure with flexibility and options, various options to communicate, clear norms, and small commitments. But make sure that you take the different ways that these different cultures work. Make sure you take that into account, establish clear rules, and give everybody the opportunity to shine. And with this, I'd like to thank everybody for their for being with me, and I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Well, first of all, I have to say thank you so much. That was such a brilliant, fascinating talk. And
Thank
I
you,
learned so
Phyllis.
much from it, and I think everyone did. And at a time, uh, I have to just ask the first question.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, the people who are working as a team globally, they must be able to speak the language? In other words, is there a universal language that people assume?
Yes, yeah, English. They always assume English, and that's a very important, you brought up a very important point. And that is something that in intercultural trainings we go into deeper. But we speak English on a daily basis. We don't realize that other people don't speak English on a daily basis. They might have trouble expressing themselves. So they might not feel comfortable expressing themselves because they hear everybody yapping along and just talking at a rapid pace. And they might not feel comfortable because they're just not comfortable in their own English. And another thing is, as English is the language that's used, that especially here in America, we like to use a lot of sports term. You know, we've got Monday morning quarterbacking, Hail Mary, stepping up to the plate. I mean, that is just normal English for us. But in other countries, baseball is not that big of a sport. So the whole saying of stepping up to the plate doesn't mean anything to people outside of the US. So native English speakers have to be very, very mindful of the fact that they have a huge advantage in that they can freely express themselves and that other people cannot express themselves as comfortably. So give those other people time and summarize. So you meant to say, do I understand correctly? And as a native English speaker, don't use all these sports terms. So thank you for bringing that up, Phyllis.
And
of course, add, sorry. Good. Yeah. May I add something?
Yes, yeah.
To your wonderful talk from my experience of being an ESL teacher
yes.
for many, many years. I taught English to foreign students who were actually very accomplished and very advanced in their subjects and also in their studies. There were a group of business students from Fordham University that I was tutoring, and I was teaching them how to communicate in English about the business proposals that they had to make. And I saw the differences between what they brought with their culture and their language.
Yes.
And because the main difference is that some languages getting from one point to another go in a circular fashion.
Yes.
And English has to go in a straight line. And that was very, very hard for some students to do. And
yes.
Some of the students who were presenting their products to be sold in supermarkets were constantly talking about themselves. And I said, well, what is the product? And they said, but I have to present this, but I have to. So that was really very, very interesting for me to see how these students, being very competent in their subjects, were approaching the English language and communication in English. So this talk is just right up my alley. It's just absolutely wonderful to understand how it's not just the business proposals, but through the language, they express their culture and their problems. So thanks for listening to me.
Exactly, Zia. Yes, yeah. I would have loved to talk more about communicating, direct, indirect, linear, circular.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, communicating from the heart. That is a fascinating, subject. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Tracy, I see you have a question.
Yes. In your past experiences, I'm sure you've come in contact with companies that are successful at offering diverse, either ethnic, racial, cultural environments. Which companies actually do it best? And what foundations have they actually laid to be successful and be in that 30%, 25 to 30% better success rate that McKinsey identified?
Oh boy, which companies? Pharmaceuticals are very good at it. I don't, off the top of my head, I'm sure I don't know which companies, but it's very often the big international companies that spent the money on transferring employees back and forth, that value, that sent their high potentials to live in another country for a few years. And those are companies that, yeah, they really put their money there. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question was, what do? They do
Yeah,
a
what
lot.
kind of foundation? Yeah.
Yeah. They do a lot of rotation. They are very generous in sending people abroad, whether it's for a short-term assignment, for a long-term assignment, but they're very generous in making sure that people get this international exposure.
Do you think that has changed recently, in recent years, given the fact that we have a greater degree of technology and a greater ability to interact and communicate at a distance than we had, say, 20 years ago, where people had to actually travel to other countries to do business effectively?
Yes, that has, yeah, technology definitely, that people can work together like we're doing now, Zoom. That has definitely made it better. But what I found, I've been in this business for over 13 years. And when I first started, moving abroad was it was a scary thing. People didn't travel as much. And nowadays, moving abroad, everybody's traveled, everybody's studied abroad. It's the fact that that people travel so much more, and that countries have opened up, and that going to a foreign country is no longer as scary as it used to be.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I saw some other hands.
Yeah,
Lisa.
Hi, Annette. Thank you. I'm wondering how you got started in your business.
By taking my daughter to the park and pushing her in the swing.
Oh, yeah.
No, so I'm from the Netherlands and my husband is from Sweden, and we moved to the US. So one day I was living in Hoboken, and I took my daughter, who must have been about 6 months old. I took her to the park and was pushing her in the swing, and I happened to be standing next to another mom who also had a 6-month-old, and we started talking, and she was in this line of business. So, and she was about to move to Atlanta, and she said, "Oh my goodness, this is great. Do you want to take over my relocation work?" And I said, at that point, I was a stay-at-home mom, going slightly crazy, staying at home, and I thought this was great. So she asked, "Do you want to take over my clients?" And I said yes, and haven't looked back since then. So it
Wow.
was just pure coincidence, being in the right place at the right time and having the right
Thank you. Yeah,
background.
that's a great story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And actually, when I work a lot with expatriate spouses, so spouses who come here because their partner is moved here. And when we talk about how to find a job, I tell them networking is the most important way to find a job. Just knowing people, telling people who you are and what you can do. And then one day somebody will think of, "Oh yeah, I remember I met this person." And that is something that is very different in the United States than in other countries. Networking is the way to find a job here in the US, less so in Europe.
Right. Well, thank you. That's
Thank you.
How do your clients find you?
Well, I work for different agencies, and I do a lot of marketing on LinkedIn, but again, networking. I got to know Phyllis, and Phyllis asked me to talk, and I've been doing that. How long have I been doing that on a yearly basis, Phyllis?
Well, since 2016,
There you go. Yeah.
we're almost at almost 5 years.
Next
And
year
every
will be-
time I've asked you, you've done it, and you've been so gracious about doing it. I do appreciate it. And we've
Well,
learned every time.
right. It's so much fun, and it's such a wonderful audience. So, Amira, to answer your question, yeah, again, a lot of networking. I'm very active in the Dutch community. So I'm just telling people who I am, and telling them what I can do, and that's where I find my clients.
And it's India, who you are related to is very important, because that's how you get your recommendations. I come from India, so I know some of the culture, how that works.
Yes. So did you agree when I had the slide with trust? Did you agree that
Yes,
trust is much more
absolutely,
relationship
on
based?
spot. Yes, yes, culturally, that's exactly the way they are. So that was very interesting to me, how you picked up on that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any questions on the phone? Because I've been seeing people raise their hands, but those of you who joined us by phone, no questions there?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Everything that you said really revolves around trust and communication.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what country you're from, I think, because in our country, that's missing right now. And I just wanted to ask you, like the pandemic that is so worldwide,
Yeah.
and the World Health Association, we have to be a part of it. And that's and also with global warming, how do you get our governments on board with it, or the other governments who are looking politically as compared to thinking about humanity?
That is the $1 million
I'm
question.
sorry, I have to
No,
I'm so frustrated.
yeah. And that is why all these agreements take so long to hammer out, because because of building that trust. A lot of when Corona first hit, people called it the China virus. Well, that dissipated all the trust. Trust is so important, and to build it, even here in the US, you have to build it by spending time. And I have a slide, and let me see if I can. Oh gosh, I'm going to. No, I can't find the slide right now. But there's a slide, that slide that I showed with the Netherlands, US, India, and China about the different dimensions. It's very important for the world leaders to understand those different dimensions and to understand how the other person thinks. And that's why it's very important that there is one cultural collaborator who sets the rules and who brings these cultures together. That's why these processes, what you see on TV, when they signed the Paris Climate Accord, that wasn't made in one day. That was made in months, years, maybe
Yes.
years of negotiating, bilateral negotiations. The US negotiated with they agreed on something, and then they met other blocks. It's years and years of negotiations, and those people who did the negotiations are very skilled at understanding who their partners are and what makes them tick. And hold on, I just want to show you the chart of the G20. It is such an interesting chart. If only I can find it.
You gave a great answer to a problem that needs more trust and communication.
Oh, if
And less politicizing.
let me see pictures. Oh, if there is one picture that will answer this question. If only I can find it. And once I show you that, oh no, well, I can't find it, but it's basically that map that I showed you, but then with 20 countries showing the G20, and it's just a mix.
Right.
So that just shows the importance of having somebody there who understands what makes the other person what motivates the other person. And so one of my friends in DC works in the OECD, and I think she told me it takes like 1.5, 2 years before they finally have an agreement. And that's 1.5 and 2 years of going back and forth. She travels, or she used to travel to Paris every 4 months to meet and to negotiate. So I see that my parents unmuted themselves. Do you guys? So I am very proud to introduce my parents who are joining us from the Netherlands.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Mom and Dad.
Hi.
You should be so proud of your daughter.
Oh, we are.
We are certainly,
She's a love.
but we have a difficult question for our
Uh-oh.
You're familiar with the European situation as well as with the US situation. We experience here in the EU, European Union, a lot of cultural differences between, let's say, Italy, Spain, France, and the northern countries like Germany, etc., etc. How is that in the EU? We have lived 30 years ago, 40 years ago, for 3 years in the States, as you well know. And we got an impression, not much more than an impression, that there are huge differences in culture and mentality between, let's say, the West Coast. I've been talking to a guy in the state of Washington on the Northwest Coast, and it was interesting to hear him talk about, yes, I am from Washington, and he knew everything about Washington, but what happened on the East Coast was none of his business.
Right. That is a very timely question. With the Netherlands America Foundation, I will actually be facilitating a panel where we will discuss that, the regional differences within the US. There's a gentleman named Colin Woodward, and he has written a book called American Nations, and he has described 11 different cultures within the US. So just within the US, there are actually Northern America, Canada and the US, and he has described 11 different cultures. And again, culture comes from history. So he goes into why there are these 11 cultures. So for example, in Boston, the Quakers, they settled in the Boston area. And for the Quakers, education is very important. So that explains why just in Boston, there are, I think 25, just in Boston itself, there are 25 universities. New York is a lot bigger than Boston. And I don't know how many universities there are, but probably around 10. So that goes to explain these different cultures. And yes, within the US, it is very difficult. And that is something that a foreigner who wants to do business in the US thinks, I'm going to do business in the US. And they do business in New York, and they duplicate everything for their office in Georgia, and it goes horribly wrong. So we definitely have these cultural differences within the US, and Americans are not always aware of this. So again, it's very important to realize that history and geography, that create different cultures. If you look at the South, slavery, the Southern Bells, the role of women, very different than the North. And people don't realize that. And that, it's just like within the EU, people need to realize that it's different things, different motivations, different ways of interpreting the information presented. And that's why this is very important globally, but also just within the US. And again, it's being aware of these differences. And once you're aware, you can start to find ways to deal with them.
And accepting the differences.
Accepting and valuing them.
Yes.
Yeah. Once you value them, you suddenly see things from a different perspective. It's like, oh, wow, I never thought of that. So thank you, Mom and Dad.
Mhm.
You're welcome.
Thank you for raising such a beautiful daughter who's so sweet and who has educated us so much more today.
And
Thank
she
you.
educates us too from time to time.
There you go.
Most of the time.
Oh, this is so much fun.
Phyllis, do we have time for another question? I see it's
Of course we
2:05.
do.
I'm happy to go on.
Of course.
Tracy, I see you have a question.
Yes, I want to thank Mom and Dad because that's very similar to the question I wanted to ask. Given the fact that we have geographical differences here in the United States, I'm sure that within companies themselves, they have different cultural norms, not just based on where they're located, but based on where their employees have come from. Because we tend to be a very migrating nation and traveling from place to work, especially in corporate environments. So how do companies actually handle those internal differences with regard to cultural expectations and norms, and how people coming from different regions may work together real successfully, versus being or versus clashing and not having respect for each other and their cultural differences?
That is, yeah, onboarding. It is very important that when there is a new employee, and when I say new employee, new to that geographical office, that they go through an onboarding process. And with onboarding, I don't just mean, where's the copy machine and, where can you get lunch, but also this is how we do things. These are our values within this office. Of course, a company is going to have values, company-wide values, but also within the office. How do we work together? What are our policies? How do we show respect? How do we communicate? What do we accept and what do we not accept? And if you look at the numbers, companies that do active onboarding are so much more successful in retaining their employees, because that is one very important aspect of employees leaving. They're just not happy. They just cannot fit in. So spending time on onboarding, and when I say onboarding, spending time on explaining how we work together, how we create a safe space, what is our definition of a safe space, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, is very important. And the majority of the companies do not realize that there are these differences, because we're all Americans. So, why should somebody from California, moving to New Jersey, why should that be an issue? Companies don't realize that. And that is very big in employee retention. So it goes beyond just the practicals, but yeah, what do we accept and what do we not accept? And that's not only, if an employee moves, but again, when you create a new team, it's again, finding these norms, finding what constitutes a safe space and talking about it. Talking about why this is important for the team, or why this is important for me, why I will not accept this and why I cannot do that. Basically being open about it. Myra.
Have you ever done your work with political parties in this country, because they need you?
No, I have not. That's scary. That is very big. But one thing that I am finding is if you just create this awareness, I talk about it in a global sense, but the whole intercultural community is going more and more towards DEI, and DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So while I don't work with political parties, I try to get more involved in DEI and creating this awareness that we're all different, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. And especially equity, making sure, not equality, but equity, making sure that people are given the same chances, that everybody has the same chance. So while staying out of politics, the whole intercultural community is moving towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just creating, in spreading the importance of valuing differences, and that different is good, and difference is, for companies, it's profitable. And that's one thing that you see is, again, I spoke about the millennials. It's something that they don't just want, no, they require it. If you look at hiring practices, HR practices, diversity is a must. Millennials will look for companies that are big on diversity. And when I say diversity, it's not just putting out a statement on Black Lives Matter, but also having policies and what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate.
That comes from the top.
It has to come from the top. Yeah, it is demanded by, well, saying the bottom is, you know, companies are becoming more and more flat and working more and more teams. But for new hires, that is something they will look at. And that is something they will not look at a company that doesn't have a diversity statement, that doesn't have diversity hiring. Joan, I see you have a question.
Talking about millennials, but you haven't really focused on age differences as a cultural difference in your talk up to now.
Yeah.
And people of different ages really can come from different cultures, even though they're in the same geographic area, and you would think they have the same history. They don't.
Right. They don't. No. No. And that is something that diversity, you know, what is diversity? Everybody focuses on racial diversity or maybe sexual orientation diversity, but there is, besides racial and gender and sexual orientation, age diversity is so important, and is, if you look at, if you ask people how they define diversity, that's quite often not on there. And that's very sad. And that's something that should be included in the diversity talk. So that's a very good point. Do you have any experience with that, Joan?
Oh, I'm working now with age-friendly communities.
I'm sorry, with what?
Age-friendly communities, which is trying to make communities livable for all different ages.
And how do you do that?
Well, there are different ways of doing that. I focus mostly with senior groups. So I'm on our town's senior advisory committee.
Yeah.
What we find is that what works for seniors tends to work for everybody else too.
Right.
So you're trying to look at where the needs are and find common solutions.
Can you give us a practical example? And is this in South Orange, or which town is this?
This is Maplewood.
Maplewood. Okay.
I guess one example might be the town's recent ordinance on ADUs, which are accessible dwelling units. Originally, the ordinance was aimed at seniors and requiring that a senior either be the occupant of the ADU or the owner of the property. But when the town took a closer look at it, they decided that this really needed to apply to everybody. That it wasn't just the senior population that had need for ADU housing or had need for putting in an ADU unit as a means of gaining income and being able to afford taxes.
Can you just, for those who don't know, you said ADU, can you define that?
I'm sorry?
You said ADU housing. Can you define that?
Accessible dwelling units.
Okay.
These are, I guess you call them micro units.
Right.
They're small in size, but they're independent in terms of having kitchens, sanitary facilities.
Right.
I'm not hearing it clearly. Can you repeat?
No, it's hard to hear.
What didn't you hear?
It was very difficult to hear you, Joan. But Joan mentioned Maplewood, which has an ordinance about ADU, accessible dwelling units. And that was first aimed at the senior population. But what Joan said is they suddenly realized that not only seniors, but everybody needs to have access to ADU dwellings. Is that correct? Did I summarize it correctly,
That
Joan?
is correct, yes.
Thank you.
And that's, yeah, I always told my parents that they're welcome to come live in my backyard. We'll build a little house in the backyard and they're welcome to come live there.
And they look so lovely. I wish they would move here.
So do I. So do I. Yeah.
Well, it's
Just
been
one
a
comment.
pleasure.
Oh, another comment from Clara.
Yeah, New Jersey. You know, there is a big difference between North Jersey and South Jersey.
Yes.
South Jersey's more influenced by Philadelphia and North Jersey's by New York. And we pronounce words differently and a lot of other differences.
Exactly.
And it's a small state, yeah.
Exactly. Just within such a small state, there are such differences. And and again, those are geographical differences. You know, I mean, basically, we live here in a suburb of New York. Everything is, like you said, so oriented towards New York. And then if you go to Sussex, you know, it's all so rural. People live on
Oh, yeah, well, that's really north, yeah.
yeah, and they have such different mentalities. Yeah. And whenever people move here, I try to explain to them that even within towns, there's a difference. You know, the people moving to South Orange Maplewood are very different from the people moving to Milburn. And one thing is the schools are so different in Milburn than what they are here in South Orange Maplewood. And when
Absolutely.
exactly. And when I try to explain that to my my clients, that you need to pick a town where you feel comfortable, and even though South Orange Maplewood is right next to Milburn, and when you drive on Wyoming Avenue, you don't know if you're in Maplewood or if you're in Milburn. So when I tell my clients that, they're like, well, I don't see any difference. It's very difficult to understand that concept, that there are such cultural differences even between these two adjacent towns. And you know, driving Wyoming Avenue, you don't know when you're in Maplewood and when you're in Milburn, but yet you drive from one culture to another, and that is very difficult to explain that concept to foreigners.
You know what? You are so fascinating. I can't tell you. You have to come back because we have so much more to learn. I thank you so much, Annette. I thank your parents so much. They're wonderful people. You could just see that. And I wish they would move here with you. In any case, thank you so much for enriching us all. And
thank you. Yes.
And of course, we're going to come back in the spring, either in the library or
I will definitely be back. And from what I hear is maybe we should talk about diversity.
Love it. Love it. I can't wait. Take care.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. And thank you, Phyllis and Michael, for the opportunity.
Thank you all for coming. Have a good week. Stay safe, healthy, and happy.
Yeah.